love that. I can't wait to see this thing finished. Let's get into this. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and thanks so much for tuning in. Today, we're continuing with the build of my Team Associated RC10 B6.3 two-wheel drive off-road racing buggy. This is the second video in the build series of my B6.3, so if you haven't already seen the previous video on parts bags 1 and 2, I'll put it in the cards in the top corner of the video and I'll leave a link in the description below. Now in this video, we'll be focusing on parts bags 3 and 4 in an effort to keep this video a bit on the shorter side. And as with previous build videos, I'll add time markers in the description so you can reference or rewatch specific parts of the build without having to scrub through the entire video. And as always, if you want to follow along with this build series, make sure to hit that subscribe button and the little bell icon to get notifications whenever I upload the next video. Now, before I get into the build, I want to address something that wasn't covered well in the last video. This was actually brought to my attention by a viewer who's been following along with the build and who wrote me on Instagram saying he'd run into an issue installing the anti-roll bar end links right here on his B6.3. Now, I've already responded to this viewer, but I wanted to mention it here in case others were having the same problem. The reason the installation of the anti-roll bar end links wasn't covered well in the last video is because the end links themselves were not actually in either parts bag 1 or 2, which was the focus of the last video. Instead, the end links themselves were actually found in this rather large unmarked parts bag, within which is another parts bag with number 9 on it, within which is a smaller parts bag that's also unmarked, and the end links were on the end of this sprue, which largely is populated with eyelets. So if you're building your own B6.3 and can't find the anti-roll bar end links in either parts bag 1 or 2, now you know where to look for them. And their installation is really rather easy. As I mentioned in my previous video, there are slightly larger holes on one side of each end link versus the other, which can easily just be snapped into place on the pivots on either end of the anti-roll bar itself, and on the integrated pivots on the lower front suspension arms here and here. In the case of the lower front suspension arms, I would highly suggest you use a set of large needle nose pliers to press the end links into place. Getting your fingers in there is pretty much impossible. All right, now that that's out of the way, let's start this build by getting into parts bag number 3. All right, so we now have the contents of parts bag 3 all emptied out and put into these 3 bins. I've got all the plastic pieces in this bin up in here. We've got most of the sort of alloy and steel and carbon fiber pieces in this bin over here. And I've put all of the hardware pieces somewhat loosely organized in this bin over here. And I should mention the bearings that were in parts bag number 1 from our previous video are actually arranged in smaller containers over here. So now that we've got everything out of parts bag number 3, let's get started with step number 1. All right, so bag 3 step 1 has us assembling the front steering block and the front steering block arm. Now, 2 things I do need to mention about this particular step. First, the instructions actually only show one side, but it very clearly states right here that we are to build a left and a right, so we got to build 2 of these. And second is the steering blocks themselves. Now, this particular kit actually includes 2 different lengths of steering blocks. The steering blocks are here and here. There's a 3mm long pair of steering blocks, and there is a 4mm long pair of steering block. I don't know if you guys can see that on camera there, but it's clearly identified here and here. So these 2 are the 3mm ones, and these 2 here are the 4mm ones. Now, as far as the instructions are concerned, the stock setup calls for the 4mm steering blocks. So these are the 2 that we're going to be going with. So let's start getting ready to put these steering blocks together. All right, so we now actually have all the parts together for the steering blocks themselves. Now, the steering block, each assembly actually calls for 2 5x10 by 4mm bearings. Of course, the steering block itself, the front axle, which are these two very nice anodized blue pieces, and M3 by 6mm long button head cap screws. Now, these two cap screws are also going to need some Loctite, so we'll get the Loctite ready and actually start assembling these right now. Okay, so the front blocks, the front steering blocks are now completely assembled. Now, the one thing that I do want to point out is sort of their orientation. That is to say, the side of which the axle itself gets installed so that the threaded part is the correct sort of direction. Make sure that this piece here, this sort of angled piece right there, is on the side where the axle itself, so you insert it such that the threaded piece is sticking out this way. So I have to jump in here and correct myself. Turns out I was wrong about the orientation of the front axles and having the threaded end point in the same direction as the small wedge shape on the steering block. The correct orientation is with the threaded end facing the other way, away from the wedge shape on the steering block. Now, I do correct this later in the video, and I'll leave a timestamp on the screen of when it happens, but I wanted to mention this in case any of you are building your own B6.3 in real time along with this video in the hopes that you don't make the same mistake. Really sorry about that, guys. Now, let's get back to the build. That is the pair of front steering blocks. Now let's move on to the actual steering block arms themselves. So the steering block arms themselves are actually made up of these two very nice carbon fiber, and these are 1mm longer pieces than what was in the previous B6.2 kit. So we start with these. We're also going to need two heavy-duty ball studs, 6mm heavy-duty ball studs, which are right here and here, two 6mm heavy-duty ball studs, as well as an M3 locking nut, two of them, and they're both black here and here. Now we don't need any Loctite for this. This is going to be relatively straightforward assembly. So let's get into that. Okay, so the steering block arms are now fully assembled, both left and right. There you can see those. Pretty straightforward assembly. And that now brings us to the end of Parts Bag 3, step number 1. Well, let's move on to step number 2. All right, so step number 2, get some of this stuff out of the way here, has us beginning with assembling our front steering blocks with our front steering block arms and putting them together, simply using a couple of M3 by 8mm button head cap screws, which are right here. And we're going to need 2 of those per side, so a total of 4. So let's get into doing that right now. Okay, so the front steering blocks and arms are now completely assembled, both left and right hand side. So those are done. And now we assemble the front caster blocks. So the front caster blocks actually come off of here. So let's get those off the sprue right now. Okay, so we now have the two front caster blocks ready to go. We're also going to need a couple of other pieces in order to finish this assembly. One thing we will need is a caster block insert. Now, the kit itself actually includes 6 different caster block inserts, and I hope you guys can see that on camera there, but they're all marked and indicated. The kit itself includes a 0 degree, a 2.5 degree, and a 5 degree caster block. In this particular case, the kit actually calls for a 5 degree plus minus, or I believe it's a plus, is the standard insert that's normally used based on the instructions, and that's the one we're going to go with, which are these two here and here. So let's get those off the sprue right now. Okay, so now we have our 2 caster blocks ready to go. A couple more pieces that we're going to need. We're going to need 2 heavy-duty 10mm ball studs, which are here and here. So we got those. And we're also going to need 2 M3 black lock nuts, which are here and here. So now we got everything we need. Let's assemble these 2 front caster blocks. Okay, so the front caster blocks are now complete. And you can take a look at those, one side and the other side. Now, the one thing that I should mention when inserting the front caster blocks, which are here, and as I said, these are the 5 degree plus or minus 5 degree. According to the instruction, there's a little tab that when you insert it, it faces upward. Now, if you turn that around and insert it the other way, which you can do, it'll actually cause a negative 5 degree caster. So in this particular case, the instructions call for a positive 5 degree caster, which is the one we're going with. So these two, now that they're done, bring us to the end of step 2. Let's move on to step number 3. All right, so bag 3, step 3 has us assembling both our front caster blocks and our front steering blocks. However, as it turns out, it looks like I have actually made a slight mistake looking at these instructions here. So it looks like what I said earlier about the axles facing, I guess the threaded side facing in the direction of this little angled piece was wrong. They need to go the other way. I guess I misread the instructions in step number 1. So first things first, I'm going to swap these out and get these axles facing in the correct direction. So let me do that right now. All right, so I have now corrected the front steering arms. So as I said, I had it wrong in the first step. So the axles themselves, the threaded portion, should actually be facing away from that angled piece right there. Hopefully you guys can see that. So that was my mistake. Don't make that mistake when you do step 1 for parts bag number 3. But now let's get on with finishing up step number 3. So the next step is for us to assemble this with the front caster blocks. So let's do that. We're going to need a few pieces. First things first, we're going to need 4 M3 by 14mm button head cap screws, 2 per side. So get those ready. And we're also going to need some caster hat bushings. Now there's 4 different ones. The top one is what's called a 0mm, which is this one here. You can see looks a bit like a top hat, and the 0mm one has a very, very, very small flange. Very hard to see on camera right there. And the bottom one is a 3mm flange. That is the bottom one there. So let's get these assembled. Okay, so guess the front steering blocks are now completely assembled. They move pretty good too. There you guys can see them. Give you a bit of a closer look. That's what they look like. Take a look at the back side, there and there. Good. So now these need to get installed on the front suspension arms. Now in order to do that, we're going to need a caster block spacer, which I believe is this one here and this one here, these round spacers. So let's get these off the sprue right now. And we're also going to need the 2 front hinge pins. These are 3mm by 26mm in length, 1 per side. And we're also going to need 2 M3 by 4mm button head cap screws. These are tiny little things. Hopefully you guys can see them. And one goes in one suspension arm and the other will go in the other one. So let's get these installed right now. Okay, so now we have our front steering blocks installed, as well as our caster blocks, the full assembly, now installed on both sides of the front suspension. Good, that brings us to the end of bag 3, onto bag number 4. All right, so we've just emptied out parts bag number 4. We've put the plastic pieces in this bin here, the metal pieces and alloy pieces in this bin here, and any sort of hardware, which is not much for parts bag number 4, in this bin over here. Now, speaking of which, parts bag number 4, just looking at the instructions, actually doesn't have a heck of a lot of steps in it. Truth be told, it's only really 2 steps. In fact, it's only really 1 step. It's just this one here, and the second step itself is actually just sort of indicating which holes you're supposed to use for both the C plate and the D plate, which locate the rear suspension. So this should actually be pretty quick and easy. So let's get into step number 1. All right, so bag 4 step 1 begins with the installation of arm mount C, which is this really nice anodized aluminum piece, using 2 flathead countersunk screws, M3 by 6mm in size. In addition, we also have to install 2 arm mount inserts. Now, the kit itself actually comes with a number of these inserts. You may actually hear these referred to as pills in some cases. Now, this is what they look like on one side. They've got holes. Each one has a hole on it. It's not a hole that goes all the way through. On the other side, they actually have numbers and markings on them. The kit itself actually includes everything from what looks like 1 degree, half a degree, and 0. In fact, the 4 over here are all 0. Now, the kit itself in this particular case calls for a 1 degree out insert, which is actually going to be one of these here and these here. Now we'll take a close look at those. Hopefully the camera can focus, and hopefully you guys can see that, but what you see is a 1 with a dot above it. What this indicates is where that dot is installed will indicate whether it's 1 degree out or 1 degree in. Now, this entire set of pills or inserts is a tuning item. So depending on which one you use, it'll affect the way the rear suspension behaves. Now, in this case, I'm going to use what the kit instructions actually call for, which, as I said, is the 1 degree out. So let's get into that right now. All right, so that is now the installation of arm mount C, along with the 2 1 degree out inserts. So let's now move on to the next part, step number 1, which is the installation of the rear suspension arms using hinge pins and arm mount D. So here's our rear suspension arms. Let's get these off the sprue. Okay, so we now have our suspension arms ready to be installed. Let's get together the rest of the pieces that we're going to need. So we're going to need 2 threaded set screws. These are M3 by 20 millimeter set screws. They just look like long threaded rods. We're going to also need aluminum arm mount D, which is this piece here, blue anodized. We're also going to need 2 more arm mount inserts. These are 1 degree, but these are now going to be mounted inboard. So we're going to need these 2 here and here. We're going to also need 2 hinge pins. These are both 3.5 millimeter by 48 millimeters long. We're going to need the rear bumper, which is right here. Get this off the sprue. And we're also going to need 2 rear arm mount spacers, which are actually, were on the sprue that the suspension arms came off of. So that's that piece there and there. Let's get those off here right now. All right, so I believe we now have all of our parts in place. Let's start assembling. First things first, we're gonna put in the M3 by 20 millimeter set screws in the 2 suspension arms. So let's do that right now. Okay, so we now have the 2 set screws installed on the rear suspension arms there and there. Next, let's install our hinge pins and our spacers right now. All right, hinge pins and spacers are now installed along with these suspension arms. Next, we're going to install our arm mount inserts. Now these are 1 degree with the hole actually towards the inboard side. So I should mention before installing the next one, you'll notice on the inside of the arm, you'll notice there's sort of a lowered sort of area. This is the side where the insert itself, you'll notice the insert itself has a flange on it. That flange goes in this direction. It was the same for arm C, which I didn't mention during the assembly. That's how they go on. So arm mount C is now in place. And now the rear bumper gets installed back here, and that now brings us to the end of parts bag 4, step number 1. Now, unfortunately, this is how we're going to leave the rear suspension. For the time being, there are 2 more fasteners that'll be going in here and here from underneath. However, that's actually going to be installed in a later step. And as I said earlier, step 2 of parts bag 4, all it does is actually just talk about the inserts themselves and where they go, which is exactly what we've done here. So that now brings us to the end of parts bag 4, step 2, and that brings us to the end of this build video. If you found any of this useful or even mildly entertaining, consider hitting that like button. And if you want to follow along with the rest of the build series, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you know when the next video gets uploaded. Thanks very much for watching, guys. We'll catch you in the next one. See ya.